You've heard the big names: Temptations, Earth, Wind and Fire, the OJs. But the 1970s had layers, a second tier of R&B groups who could outperform almost anyone on their best night, had genuine hits, genuine talent, and somehow got left behind when history wrote the final draft. Tonight, 12 of them, their real stories, their best songs, and exactly why you should have been paying closer attention. Number 12, Bloodstone, Natural High, 1973. Bloodstone started in 1962 as a high school doo-wop group in Kansas City, Missouri. They called themselves the Sinceres, and for the better part of a decade, they played local shows, developed tight vocal harmonies, learned to play instruments, eventually graduated from doo-wop to a more contemporary R&B sound, and tried everything they could to get a record deal in America. Nobody was interested. Their managers gave them advice that would change everything: move to London, and they did. In 1971, a Kansas City soul group packed up and flew to England, where they signed a recording contract with Decca Records, worked with British blues producer Mike Vernon, who had previously produced Fleetwood Mac, and recorded their debut album. No American label had given them a shot. A British label heard what they had and signed them immediately. In 1973, they released Natural High, a ballad written by the group's own bassist, Charles McCormick, with lush string arrangements and a harmony vocal blend that feels like being lowered gently into warm water. It hit number 4 on the Billboard R&B chart, number 10 on the Hot 100, and number 40 in the UK. Blanket airplay across Europe. Their album went to number 2 on the R&B albums chart. And then, at the absolute peak of what should have been a long commercial run, tragedy arrived. Percussionist Roger Durham, one of the group's founding members, was thrown from a horse and died on July 27, 1973. He was 27 years old. The group continued without him. Charted 13 songs between 1973 and 1984 and kept performing. But the blow of losing a founding member at the moment of their biggest success changed something irreversible about the band's trajectory. They did what the Stray Cats would do nearly a decade later, went to London to find the success America wouldn't give them, and they found it. Bloodstone deserved a much longer conversation than they ever got. Number 11, The Moments, Love on a Two-Way Street, 1970. The Moments formed in the mid-1960s, based in Hackensack, New Jersey, signed to the Stang Records subsidiary of All Platinum, the label co-owned by Sylvia Robinson, who you might know better as the woman who later produced Rapper's Delight and created Sugar Hill Records. In 1968, the group recorded a song written by Robinson and Bert Keys called Love on a Two-Way Street. They recorded it as filler, album filler, something to pad out the track list. The song sat on the album for 2 years, 2 full years. And then in March 1970, Sylvia Robinson, recognizing belatedly that what they'd recorded as padding was actually extraordinary, released it as a single. It entered the R&B chart on March 28, 1970, climbed for weeks, and hit number 1 on May 16th, where it stayed for 5 consecutive weeks. It also peaked at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was certified gold. Billboard ranked it the number 25 song of the entire year of 1970. This was a song they recorded to fill empty space on an album. It became one of the biggest R&B records of the decade. The Moments were one of the most consistently productive R&B groups of the entire 1970s. Multiple #1 R&B hits, constant presence on the charts, genuine vocal craft in the tradition of close harmony group soul that was already beginning to feel old-fashioned by the mid-decade. In 1978, the members changed their name to Ray, Goodman, and Brown, and kept charting hits well into the 1980s. But they never get the credit they deserve, as The Moments and Love on a Two-Way Street, a song recorded as an afterthought, never gets the historical standing it deserves as one of the most beautiful love songs the decade produced. Number 10. Blue Magic, Sideshow, 1974. Blue Magic, Philadelphia, founded in 1972. Lead singer Ted Mills, joined by Vernon Sawyer, Wendell Sawyer, Keith Beaton, and Richard Pratt. They were a visually oriented group in the full tradition of Philadelphia soul, choreography, television appearances, Soul Train, and they had a run of chart success between 1972 and 1976 that most R&B fans have completely lost track of.
With the broken heart, you see that he is sad.
Sideshow, released in 1974 on Atco Records, is a perfect piece of early 1970s Philadelphia soul, a song built around a central metaphor of love as a circus performance, all of it hung on a melody that Mills delivers with the kind of controlled falsetto precision that was the Philadelphia sound's signature. It hit number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, sold over 1 million copies, and earned the group a gold record. Over the course of their commercial peak from 1972 to 1976, Blue Magic racked up 6 top 20 R&B hits, not 1 or 2, 6. They followed up with a 42-week world tour, 42 weeks, covering 48 American states, 5 countries in Europe, and a 10-day stint in the Philippines. For a Philadelphia soul group that most contemporary R&B listeners couldn't name today, that's an extraordinary commercial footprint. The group was produced and supported within the Philadelphia international orbit, and they had all the ingredients to be lasting household names: the harmonies, the choreography, the production quality, the television presence. What they didn't have was the specific luck and timing and label support that elevated the OJs or Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes above the rest of the Philadelphia pack. Sometimes that's all it takes: 6 top 20 hits, 1 gold record, a 42-week world tour, completely forgotten.
If you've made it this far into the video, you're clearly part of the community, so please hit subscribe. It costs nothing and helps us immensely. Now, for those already subscribed, very few of you have made the jump to our membership, and that's a hard pill to swallow because you're the ones who know our value best. If this channel has moved you or inspired you, consider joining. It's the price of 1 coffee, but it's the literal fuel for this channel. Let's keep this alive together. Back to the story.
Number 9. The Detroit Emeralds, Feel the Need in Me, 1972. Brothers Ivory, Abram, Cleophas, and Raymond Tillman formed a vocal harmony group in Little Rock, Arkansas in the early 1960s. They were Arkansas boys who moved to Detroit, renamed themselves the Detroit Emeralds to represent their new city, and tried to build a career in the shadow of Motown's enormous commercial machine. They had early success on Rick Tick Records, a Detroit independent that was doing solid R&B business in the late 1960s. And then Motown bought Rick Tick, absorbed its catalog, and lost interest in most of the label's artists. The Detroit Emeralds lost their label overnight. Armin Baladian signed the remaining trio to Westbound Records in 1969, and they started over, producing 4 R&B top 10 hits between 1971 and 1973, including Do Me Right, You Want It, You Got It, and Baby Let Me Take You, In My Arms. One of their background musicians during this period was a 13-year-old bass player named Michael Henderson, who would go on to become one of the most in-demand session bassists in jazz and R&B history, playing with Miles Davis. Feel the Need in Me was recorded in 1972 and released in 1973. In America, it reached number 22 on the pop chart. In the UK, it reached the top 5. A deeper, warmer piece of soul balladry than their earlier up-tempo hits, it captured something about the quiet desperation of needing someone that the group had been building toward across their whole career on Westbound. The Detroit Emeralds eventually split into 2 competing versions of the same group, a not uncommon fate for R&B acts of the era who outlasted their original lineup. From their ranks came the Floaters, who we'll hear about shortly. Arkansas roots, Detroit name, a career built twice after losing their label once. Number 8, Chairmen of the Board, Give Me Just a Little More Time, 1970. Years from now we'll surely... Here is a Detroit soul story with a specific layer of music industry history that most people have missed. After Holland Dozier Holland, the legendary songwriting and production team behind most of Motown's biggest hits, had their falling out with Berry Gordy in 1968 and left Motown, they didn't disappear. They founded their own label, Invictus Records. And one of the very first groups they signed was Chairmen of the Board. The group was led by General Norman Johnson, a Virginia-born singer-songwriter who had already been writing hits for other artists for years. His voice is one of the most distinctive in 1970s soul, high, urgent, slightly hoarse around the edges, with the evangelical intensity of a preacher who has just remembered something important mid-sermon. You'd know it in 2 seconds if you heard it. You probably don't know the name attached to it. Give Me Just a Little More Time, released in December 1969 and charting into early 1970, hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and sold over 1 million copies. It's a breakup song, written from the perspective of someone who knows the relationship is ending,
Sing with me. One time, Rick.
but is asking, not begging, asking, for enough time to make one more attempt. Johnson's delivery turns what could be a desperate plea into something with real dignity. The production has every hallmark of HDH's Motown work. The hand claps, the horn stabs, the strings, now deployed on their own label for their own act. Holland Dozier Holland proved at Invictus that their talent wasn't Motown specific. And Norman Johnson proved that his voice belonged in any conversation about the great soul vocalists of his era. Chairman of the Board, criminally underrated, completely forgotten by most. Number 7, The Floaters, Float On, 1977. The Floaters came directly out of the Detroit Emeralds. James Mitchell, who had been a Detroit Emeralds vocalist, formed the new group with his brother Paul Mitchell, along with Larry Cunningham, Charles Clark, and an unrelated Ralph Mitchell. They were from the Sojourner Truth housing projects on Detroit's east side. They signed with ABC Records in 1976 and prepared their debut. The concept for Float On came to James Mitchell in a dream. He woke up, jumped out of bed, and hummed the melody and basic structure into a tape recorder so he wouldn't lose it. The idea he'd captured was simple and slightly absurd. and completely irresistible. Each member of the group would introduce himself to the listener by his first name and his astrological sign, then describe his ideal romantic partner, Aquarius, Cancer, Leo, Libra, one by one, like the world's most earnest personal ad, set to the warmest soul groove of 1977.
Understand what I'm saying? I want you to.
The Grokopedia entry on the Floaters notes that the guitar effect on Float On was directly inspired by the Dramatics' In the Rain, which connects these two Detroit groups in a direct musical lineage. The song itself is nearly 12 minutes long on the album version. The single edit runs just over 4 minutes and hit number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 1 on the R&B chart for 6 weeks, and number 1 on the UK singles chart. People laughed at the concept, and then they couldn't stop listening.
So flow with me, baby.
The pickup lines, "To me, all women are wildflowers," became cultural shorthand for a very specific kind of 1970s sincerity that is either deeply cheesy or deeply charming, depending entirely on your disposition. James Mitchell dreamed it. They recorded it. The world played it constantly for the summer of 1977. That's the whole story, and it's more than enough. Number 6. The Main Ingredient. Everybody Plays the Fool, 1972. Cuba Gooding, not Cuba Gooding Jr., the Oscar-winning actor's father. Cuba Gooding Sr., lead singer of a New York R&B vocal trio called The Main Ingredient. Formed in 1964, originally as a group called The Poets, they signed to RCA Records in the early 1970s, changed the lineup, changed the name, and in 1972 recorded one of the most immediately recognizable soul records of the decade. Everybody Plays the Fool was written by J.R. Bailey, Rudy Clark, and Ken Williams. It is built on one of the most honest, quietly devastating premises in popular music. Everyone at some point makes a complete fool of themselves over love. That's not a criticism or a judgment. It's simply a fact about being alive. Cuba Gooding Sr. delivers that thesis with a warmth and wry specificity that makes it feel less like a ballad and more like a conversation with someone who has been there, knows exactly how you feel, and is genuinely not laughing at you. Everybody Plays the Fool hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 5 on the R&B chart. It remains one of the most sampled and referenced soul records in hip-hop history, used in countless productions. In 1991, Aaron Neville covered it and took it back to the top 5, introducing it to a new generation. The song has never gone away, but ask most people who recorded the original and you'll get a blank look. Cuba Gooding Sr. was the Main Ingredient's lead voice through their commercial peak. His son grew up watching him perform and later said his father's work ethic shaped his own approach to acting. The Main Ingredient charted consistently through the mid-1970s, never quite broke into the upper tier of recognition, and remain one of the most undervalued acts in the entire history of New York soul. Number 5, Tavares. It Only Takes a Minute. 1975. 5 brothers, Ralph, Pooch, Chubby, Butch, and Tiny Tavares, born Antone, Feliciano, Arthur, Perry Lee, and Victor, respectively. Grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, singing together from early childhood. Their father was a Cape Verdean immigrant who had himself been a performer. By the time they were recording for Capitol Records in the early 1970s, they had been a functioning vocal group for over a decade. It Only Takes a Minute was released in 1975 and hit number 10 on the R&B chart. It's a piece of up-tempo soul with a rhythm section and horn arrangement that feels physically urgent, a song about how quickly love can arrive, delivered by five brothers who had been harmonizing together since childhood in a way that makes the harmonies sound genuinely effortless, because for them, they essentially were. In 1976, the group reached their commercial peak with the disco-adjacent hit Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel, which went top 5 on the pop chart. They kept recording through the late 1970s, performed on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and built a devoted European fan base that remained loyal long after American radio had moved on. And in 1992, British pop group Take That covered It Only Takes a Minute and took it to number 7 on the UK charts, introducing Tavares' song to a generation of British teenagers who had no idea the original existed. When Robbie Williams later left Take That and built his solo career, he carried with him a fan base that had learned what soul music felt like through a Tavares cover. That's an indirect legacy worth naming. Five brothers from New Bedford, a harmony that sounded like it cost nothing to produce because it had been developing naturally since childhood. Completely underrated. Number 4. The Trammps, Disco Inferno, 1976. The Trammps started in Philadelphia in the late 1960s as a straight soul group. Lead singer Jimmy Ellis had a voice that could rattle window frames, a full-throttle gospel-trained instrument with the kind of raw power that made casual listeners stop mid-conversation. Songwriter Earl Young, who drummed for the Trammps, was also one of the session musicians who helped create the Philadelphia International sound as a member of the house band MFSB. Disco Inferno was released in 1976 on Atlantic Records and was initially a modest R&B hit. It charted. It didn't transform the group overnight. The song is nearly 11 minutes long in its full album version, a sprawling, percussion-driven epic that builds from a relatively controlled opening into something that feels, by the end, like a genuine emergency. Jimmy Ellis's vocal escalates in proportion. What begins as a confident lead becomes, by the closing minutes, something that sounds like a man, literally Dorkins, on fire, which was the entire point. Then Saturday Night Fever happened. In 1977, the film's producers chose Disco Inferno for the soundtrack, alongside the Bee Gees and other artists. And introduced the song to a global mainstream audience that had never heard it. The Trammps performed the song at the Academy Award ceremony when the soundtrack won. Overnight, a 1976 Philadelphia soul record became one of the most recognizable songs of the entire disco era. The cruel irony is that their earlier soul work, the records they made before Disco Inferno, redefined how the world saw them, is better than most people realize. The Trammps were a Philadelphia soul group that a disco film turned into a disco act. They were always more than that. But Burn, Baby Burn is what the world remembered, and there are worse things to be remembered for. Number 3. Royce, Wishing on a Star, 1977. Here is how Royce began. A Los Angeles instrumental ensemble called Total Concept Unlimited had been playing together since the early 1970s. A large, disciplined band of exceptional musicians led by trumpeter Kenny Copeland. They served as the backing band for Edwin Starr. And then legendary Motown producer Norman Whitfield heard them, signed them to his own Whitfield Records label, and renamed them after something he treasured, his Rolls Royce. he still needed a lead vocalist. A touring member of the Undisputed Truth spotted a singer named Gwen Dickey performing with a local group called the Jewels in Miami, Florida, on a tour stop. He told Whitfield about her. Whitfield flew her to Los Angeles to audition. She was from Biloxi, Mississippi, gospel-trained, with a voice that had the warmth of a Southern church choir and the precision of someone who had been performing her whole life. She was hired. She performed under the stage name Rose Norwalt. In 1976, Whitfield put the group on the soundtrack of a Richard Pryor film called Car Wash, and Car Wash hit #1 on the pop chart. The following year, on the group's formal debut album, they recorded Wishing on a Star. The song had been offered to Barbra Streisand for an album project. She declined. The song was written by former Undisputed Truth member Billy Ray Calvin and produced by Whitfield, built around Gwen Dickey's voice, hovering over sparse piano and strings in a way that makes the longing in the lyric feel completely physical. Wishing on a Star charted modestly in the US. It was a top 3 hit in the UK. Jay-Z covered it in 1998 and brought Gwen Dickey back to record new vocals. Beyoncé covered it in 2005. Madonna covered Love Don't Live Here Anymore. 3 legendary acts covered the work of a group that still doesn't have the household name recognition it deserves. Royce, an extraordinary band that the world almost figured out. Number 2, The Dramatics, What You See Is What You Get, 1971. The Dramatics began in Detroit in the early 1960s as a vocal group called The Dynamics. They changed their name, bounced around local labels, released records that didn't chart, shuffled lineups, and kept trying. By 1969, they had signed to Stax's Volt subsidiary. And then got dropped after one unsuccessful single. By any reasonable measure, they should have been finished. They were spotted performing at a Detroit nightclub in 1971 by songwriter and producer Tony Hester, who offered them a song he'd written called What You See Is What You Get. The title was a catchphrase at the time, popularized by comedian Flip Wilson's character Geraldine Jones on national television. Hester's production showcased the Dramatics' greatest asset: the fact that they had multiple lead singers, each with a distinct voice and personality, who could trade verses and build momentum in ways that single lead groups couldn't match. The song hit number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 3 on the R&B chart. It went gold. What you get? Ha! What you see? Stax re-signed them immediately. An 8-month national tour with James Brown followed, during which Brown famously told them, "I love you guys 'cause you sweat a lot." High praise in its way. The Dramatics performed What You See Is What You Get at the legendary 1972 Watt-Stax concert in Los Angeles. But here is the full story. Tony Hester, the man who spotted them in a nightclub, offered them the song, produced their breakthrough, and wrote their signature ballad, In the Rain, developed a serious drug problem in the years that followed their success. He fell in with the wrong crowd. He died of gunshot wounds in 1980. He was 34 years old. The man who gave the Dramatics their career didn't live to see 35. What you get? Ha! What you see? Number 1, The Dramatics, In the Rain, 1972. I don't want you to see me cry. The song that closes this countdown is not the flashiest record on the list. It doesn't have the hardest story, or the most dramatic origin, or the wildest piece of industry trivia attached to it. What it has is something simpler and more durable. It is one of the most beautiful soul ballads ever recorded. In the Rain was released in February 1972. the second single from the Dramatics' debut album, again written and produced by Tony Hester. The recording begins with the sound of actual rain and distant thunder. Not a sample, not a sound effect added in post-production, but a deliberate atmospheric choice that tells you exactly where you are before a single note of music has played. You're outside, it's raining, someone is either leaving or has already left. The instrumentation builds slowly, strings first, then a bass figure, then the rhythm section settling in, and then Ron Banks takes the lead vocal, and the album version, which runs over 5 minutes, gives him and the group enough space to actually inhabit the emotional landscape of the song instead of just passing through it. The scatting that closes the record, building in intensity as the strings swell, is one of the more overlooked vocal performances in the Stax catalog. In the Rain, hit number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, higher than What You See Is What You Get, and hit number 1 on the R&B chart. It is frequently cited by soul and R&B critics as one of the genre's underappreciated masterworks. The Floaters' Float On, which we heard earlier, directly borrowed its guitar effect from In the Rain, a Detroit musical lineage running through two groups. One song inspiring another, all of it built on a producer who would be dead at 34. If you remember one song from this entire countdown, let it be this one.